You always have to remember the last week in Chodesh Adar, there's a term that's used called Seif Zman. But we have to remember that it's a hachona for Tchilas Hashana. The same way if it would be the week before Rosh Chodesh Tishrei, the last week of Elul, nobody says, it's the last week. The end of the year, the last week, we could let things slide. The last week of Adar is really a hachona for starting the next year on the right foot. So Baruch Hashem, Bais Medrash is full. Darum's learning, and learning Hilchos Krias HaTorah, which is there's so many nice sugis, so many geshmak sugis to learn. So Baruch Hashem, I always say that there's a parallel between the last week of Adar and between, again, preparing and the end of Elul for Yom Kippur. And that is that the 7 days between Chav Gimel, Adar, and Rosh Chodesh Nisan, Moshe Rabbeinu was the one who did the Avodah. So it steht in Pashas Tetzav and Pashas Tzav. Moshe Rabbeinu during the Shivas Yemei Miluim, and Rashi says, what did Moshe Rabbeinu wear? Moshe Rabbeinu wore a Chaluk Lovon. The Sfarim say this is the makor of the Yiddish Beged that's called a kittel. So the last week of Adar is sort of like a hachana. It's really what that really means to say to us. When do we wear a kittel? By the Seder. So when you learn well, and the Bais Medrash has a Kol Torah, and we go into Rosh Chodesh Nisan with a bren, with a chizuk, with a geshmak, that really sets the tone. HaChodesh HaZalochem is the Shabbos, and then the days of Nisan, which is the beginning of creating a Hizchachos Hashana. Telem Shemitz Hashem have this Yat Tishmai to go towards Leil Seder with a geshmak, with a bren, with an enthusiasm. Shul B'Zaychem Yetz Hashem this year the Seder should be in Yerushalayim Ir HaKodesh. Let's try to discuss a few of the inyanim, a little bit in Hilchis Krias HaTorah. So this is something which I'm sure you've met up with. It's what's called the famous Shiur of Krias HaTorah, is a Chovas Yochid or a Chovas Rabbi. I'm sure it's come up in discussions. I want to present to the Olam, there's an interesting back and forth, and maybe this is a new way of looking at it, an interesting back and forth between the Chiyuv of Torah and Tefillah. Perhaps the two pillars of a Yid's life is Torah and Tefillah. Zavaida, there's mitzvahs, but when we ask ourselves, what's our primary role as Yidden? So Torah, Talmud Torah Keneged Kulam, Navaida, that's our connection with the Rebbeinu Shalom. Torah and Navaida, Torah and Tefillah have an interesting parallel, and this parallel lies at the heart of a ha'orah that was asked and questioned on Reb Chaim Brisker's personal anhaga and how he used to daven, how he used to hear Krias HaTorah. The shaila goes like this: Tefillah is, we know, is a takonim d'Rabbanan, 3 tefillas a day. The Gemara in Brachos tells us that's patterned on the karbonos. Korban Tamid Shel Shachar, Korban Tamid Shel Ben Arbayim, the HaTorah Seimurim that were at night. So tefillah primarily, the model of tefillah is something that was a Korban Tamid. The Korban Tamid was hukrav on behalf, for and on behalf of Gans Klal Yisrael. The Beis HaMikdash, the Mokum Avodah, the Mizbeach, Shlomo HaMelech gives it a name. We mentioned it's a pasuk. Ki beisi beis tefillah yikar l'chol ha'amim. Ki beisi, the house of Hashem, the mokum ha'avodah, the mizbeach, is beis tefillah. The makor of tefillah is come from the mizbeach, and the Beis HaMikdash is a mokum ha'rabim. Now there is a place in a Yid's life, a very important role, called tefillas yochid. The Ramban holds that Tfilas Rabbim Betzim is not a deraisa at all. Tfilas Yochid is a deraisa. Tfilas Yochid means whenever you're faced with a trying, challenging situation, and you turn to the Rebbeinu Shalom and say, Rebbeinu Shalom, please help me. This is the type of tefillah that Erlich Yidden engage in all the time. Briskerov, famously, whenever somebody would ask him a difficult shaila, he would always say quickly a tefillah under his breath. He was chayshish that if you don't know what to answer, somebody asks you something that you need Siyat Tishmai to answer, that's sort of like an Eis Tzara. And he was chayshish that there's a Chiyav Deiraisa to be mispal upset tefillah, and he would say a tefillah under his breath. Try it the next time. You're in a grocery store, and you know you have an appointment, and you can't find the things that are on your list. Say a 5-second tefillah to the Rebbeinu Shalom, because it's a shtickle Eis Tzara. It gets you into a win. This is the type of tefillah I always tell the women, that is the primary tefillah. The women are davening primarily tefillahs deiraisas. Us men are davening tefillahs that are d'Rabbanan 3 times a day. I'm not underplaying it, but tefillah deiraisa is tefillas yochid. But tefillah, in terms of a rabbim, the choivas tefillah, shachris, mincha, ma'ariv, davening b'tzibur, is really the etzem, not just an added, we daven, plus we daven with a minyan. The whole surah of the davening is really comes from karbonis, which is only berabim. There is no such thing as tfilas yochid by shachas. So it makes sense that the imperative to daven the 3 tefillas a day, shachas, mincha, marav with a minyan, is not just an added plus. That's, we would say in yeshivish, the etzem chefza of the tefillah is that, because that's tefillas come from karbonis. Mashenkin, if you think about it, Torah is very different. Torah is a mitzvah in Krishma. Krishma is not a mitzvah rabbim. Krishma you say in bed at night, the same way you say it in the morning in the shul. The choivas Krishma, Kabbalah Sol Malchus Shamayim, Kabbalah Sol Torah, Vishnantum Vanechav Dibartabam B'Shivtakal B'Veisecho, has nothing to do with the rabbim. Has nothing to do with other people. It's on the doorway of your house. It's on your arm. It's on your head. And it's every second that a yid has is a choivas Talmud Torah. Person's walking in the street, he's driving in the car, he can listen to a shiur, he can think in learning, he can think about a kasha, he can take out a sefer. It's nothing to do with others. It's not a choivas rabbim. If we ask ourselves, have on somebody for a drink of water? Thank you. The choivas rabbim and the choivas yochid, which one would we give more weight to the choivas rabbim? We would say tefillah is much more of a zach which is shaykh to the rabbim than Torah, which is primarily a choivas yochid. That being said, I'll just add one more detail to that ha'ara, and that is that Torah, part of what makes Talmud Torah the overriding and overwhelming responsibility that it is that there's no zman shkech. The reason why Torah is everything, it's not just a mitzvah, it's everything, is because there's no place or time or circumstance that gives a person a p'tur from Talmud Torah. Any circumstance in a person's life, there's a machal of Talmud Torah, sometimes more intense, less intense, longer, shorter, etc. Kafi your kaiches, kafi the situation, but Talmud Torah is everything. Tefillah is very time bound. Shachris has a time, Mincha has a time, Marav has a time. You can't be in Tefillah mode and just daven Mincha 4 times one afternoon. You might be in the mood, but it doesn't work. There are other things you could do to fill that need, but we don't daven Mincha 4 times. Tefillah is very mugbal, is very defined by times. It's a very interesting halacha. There's something in Chazal, we don't really have that distinction. Look at the Bais Medrash Ohr, it's a Makom Tefillah. If there's any place in Klal Yisrael that's a Makom Tefillah, it's this Bais Medrash. And Baruch Hashem, it's a Makom Torah, the Elm's learning. But Chazal had 2 distinct places, the Gemara Megillah Barichus. One's called a Bais Medrash, and one's called a Bais Knesses. The Kedusha of a Bais Knesses in the Gemara Megillah is considered Koidim. It's a shot of selling, raising money. For which one? The one that has more Kedusha is a Bais Knesses. Talmud Torah is above Tefillah. Talmud Torah Keneged Kulam. Tefillah is secondary. Why is the Kedusha of a Bais Medrash secondary to the Kedusha of a Bais Knesses? I heard this many, many years ago. This is from Shmuel Kamenetsky. The answer is Hagufa. Torah is above time and space. And if Torah is above time and space, the mokoim where one learns is secondary. Tefillah is very much a time, a place. The same way karbonos have to be brought in a certain place. So Tefillah is in a certain place. You have a makom kavur. There's no such thing as a makom kavur where you learn. You learn when you're waiting by the bus. When you're by a red light, you have time to listen to a svara. You listen to a svara. There's no place and time for Torah. So because of that, the mokoim where you learn is really secondary. That's not the mitzvah itself. So the Kedusha of a Bais Medrash is secondary to the Mokum Bais Knesses. Now, going back to our order. So if we would ask ourselves where the Iker Choivas Tzibur is, we would say more by Tefillah than by Torah. Now by Torah there is no Choivas Tzibur. Not so. The whole Krias HaTorah is L'cha'oira, a Choiv to learn Torah as a Tzibur. The Makor of Krias HaTorah, Sheni, Chamishi, V'Shabbos, the Rambam says, comes from the Gemara, that Moshe Rabbeinu tikkun sholosh pa'amim b'shvua, Monday, Thursday, and Shabbos, that a Yid hears Krias HaTorah because it shouldn't go 3 days. A Yid shouldn't go 3 days without, they got tomorrow right after Krias Yam Suf, and the Yid can't go 3 days without water. They said, we need water to drink. And that means they needed Torah to learn. So l'chayra, that means that Krias HaTorah has to do with Limud HaTorah. But not as a tzibur. L'chayra is a yachid. Torah is not about tzibur. But Krias HaTorah is the place where there's a choivas Limud HaTorah b'tzibur. And Reb Chaim Brisker had a mechutin whose name was Rebellion Pruzhaner. He was an uncle of Reb Moshe Feinstein, a Gav Rabba Admoid, and he was matmiya on Reb Chaim had an interesting manhaga. Kiyadua in Brisk, I'm not advising it for anybody. I'm not advising it for anybody. I emphasize. In Reb Chaim, the Briskerov, their descendants, they want to daven at their own pace, their own style. Brisk, they have a very defined way of davening. And very many of the tefillos they daven b'yachid. They feel that their need to concentrate and be medactic and daven in their style has precedence over tefillah b'zmana. So Reb Chaim at home, tefillah b'tzibah, I'm sorry, chas v'shalom, not tefillah b'zmana, tefillah b'tzibah. So Reb Chaim at home would daven. He would find, when it worked for him, he would daven 12 o'clock at night when it worked for him, and he was not particularly bothered by the fact that he was davening b'yachidus. Whereas Krias HaTorah, if Reb Chaim would daven b'yachidus, he would be very matriach to put together a minyan of people that hadn't heard Krias HaTorah, and he would go to another town, he would go to the other end of town to hear Krias HaTorah, b'tzibur on Monday and Thursday. And Rebbe Pruzhaner's mechutin held that mamish, the imperative should be mamish faked. When you talk about tefillah, the cheftza of tefillah is to do it together with the tzibur, like we're saying. Lefi what we're describing, the horror is a very, very, very solid horror. Tefillah, by definition, is an expression of a chayvas rabbim. Krias HaTorah, l'chayr is a chayvas yachid. Elamai Krias HaTorah, not Limud HaTorah. Krias HaTorah is only a chayvas tzibur. That means Limud HaTorah and Krias HaTorah have nothing in common. Limud HaTorah primarily is a chayvas yochid. Krias HaTorah is, they made a takana of, there's a chayvas Limud HaTorah barabim. It has nothing to do with Limud HaTorah, so it's not a chayvas yochid. Rabbi Pruzhaner's opinion was also the opinion of Reb Chaim's own shver, who in the yeshiva Volozhin, when Reb Chaim used to do this, of trying to put together a minyan of Krias HaTorah, his shver, who was before Volozhin, was also Adam Gadol Admoid. He was the son-in-law of the Netziv, the Rosh Yeshiva Volozhin, would refuse to cooperate because he held that Krias HaTorah is a chayvas yochid. It's a chayvas tzibur. The yeshiva, the shul, has a chayvas Krias HaTorah. What happens if somebody had to go out? He was an honest. He went out and millah Krias HaTorah. It's not mechuyev now to go to another minyan. This is the minyan where he's davening. The minyan had a functional Krias HaTorah. Sheva kruim, asar psukim. They laned. Finished. By corona, was there any chiyuv to go back and make up parshias that anybody missed? No. It's a chayvus harabim. There were those that said, you remember by corona, that when we were able to get back together again, that it's the chayvus harabim, in order that we should be in sync with finishing off, with being on the right track, so we should lane all the parshias together until we get to the parsha, wherever everybody, Lefi, when they joined up again with a minyan, where they were. But there's no chayv on that, a yochid. The chayv is mutal on the tzibur. Reb Chaim Kanir held not that way. Reb Chaim held that Krias HaTorah, this is Reb Chaim's famous chiddush, that even though Krias HaTorah clearly is a chayvas rabbim, like we're saying, Limud HaTorah is a chayvas yochid, but Krias HaTorah is a chayvas tzibur, but it's a chayvas tzibur to be mutal. It's a chayvas tzibur which is mechayiv every yochid to be part of a tzibur. Interesting, very interesting chiddush. It's a chayvas tzibur, but it's a chayvas tzibur that's mechayiv each yochid to have to be part of a tzibur. Okay, so if you miss Krias HaTorah, go find yourself a shul on the other side of town. That's what Reb Chaim held. It's interesting. We just went through Purim Meshulish. Everybody knows in Yerushalayim, whereas normally they lane on Tez Vov. This year they laned on Yidal on Friday. It's an interesting halacha that comes up in the context of this discussion because Rebbe Pruzhaner, Reb Chaim's mechutin, brought Reb Chaim a raya Keneged Shita, so he held that Krias HaTorah is a Choivas Tzibur, not more. There's no Choivas Yochid to be part of a Tzibur. There's a Choiv on the Tzibur, on the Shul, to have Krias HaTorah. There's no Choiv on the Yochid to find the Shul to lein in. He brought him a raya from a Ramban in the beginning of Megillah. The Ramban says in the beginning of Megillah that there are things, the Ramban is talking over there about which things need a minyan of Asara. So he says, the Ramban says that there are things that are bi'inon Asara mitzad choivas tzibur, but Megillah is a choivas yochid. That's what the Ramban says. The Ramban says that Megillah is a choivas yochid, and the Rishonim just say that when Megillah is lein shaloi bizmano, like it was this year, because instead of Tezvav, they pushed up Krias Megillah, Yerushalayim to Yudalid, then you need a minyan. So the Ramban is inherently saying that there are certain things that are, he says it on Krias HaTorah. Krias HaTorah is a Choivas HaTzibur, Megillah is a Choivas Yochid. The Rabbi Pujana brought a smach to his shita that there is no individual obligation called Krias HaTorah. Krias HaTorah by definition is only a Choivas HaRabbim. Reb Chaim answered back, or I take that back, I don't know if Reb Chaim answered back, the Welt Tainas on behalf of Reb Chaim Shita, that the other way to understand this is by saying the Ramban over slightly differently. The Ramban doesn't mean a Choivas Tzibur, a minyan. Krias Megillah needs a minyan not mitzad dinim like Kaddish, Baruch Hu, Moedim D'Rabbanon, Beches Kainim. Megillah needs a minyan mitzad Pesumei Nisa. The raya to this is that if you're Yerushalayim this year, you know, very many husbands come home after Megillah, they lay Megillah for their wives. In Yerushalayim this year, there was no such thing, no husbands, no democracy. No husbands going home and laying for their wives. Why? Because since it was a Kriya Shalei Bizmana, the Rishonim say that a Kriya Shalei Bizmana needs Asora, it has to be done the optimal fashion. But guess what? The Asora doesn't have to be Asora men. It can be Asora women. It's not a din in Dovish B'Kedusha needing a tzibur. The din of Asara by Krias Megillah Shalei Bizman, like you had in the times of the Gemara, where they used to come, the villagers used to come and they would lane 2 days early, that had to be Basar. Not because you need a minyan, because you need 10 people there for Pesumei Nisa. So what they have in Yerushalayim is, instead of one man laning for his wife at home, they put together a minyan of women. And that's it, that's enough. So it's not a din of Choivas Tzibur. So the Ramban saying Choivas Tzibur, that Krias HaTorah is a Choivas Tzibur as opposed to Megillah, doesn't mean Choivas Tzibur. What it means to say is that it needs, there are things that need, oh, this fell off? No, it's here. It needs a minyan asar mitzad Pesumei Nisa. Okay, so that's a Zayti and Nekuda. It's a fascinating discussion, which is negay also by Hilchos Krias HaTorah. Very many people, they want to be Mavisedra, they're laying along with the Bal Koreh. Is that a kiyum of Krias HaTorah? Does Krias HaTorah mean being Yotze with the Bal Koreh? There's no halacha that the Bal Koreh has to be Moitzi Da'il. It's only by Zocher that the one who's laying has to be Moitzi the Tzibur. There's no halacha. The Bal Koreh doesn't have to have in mind to be Moitzi the Tzibur. It's not such a halacha. It's a din that there has to be a Kriya Barabim. It's not Moitzi the Tzibur. By Megillah, everybody has to hear Megillah. The Bal Koreh has to have in mind to be Moitzi everybody. So the Briskerov famously said, and the Elam Yerushalayim is makpid on this, is that when Megillah is laying on the 14th in Yerushalayim, which is Shalai Bizmana, and the Kriya has to be a Kriyas Rabbim, the Briskerov said you can't read along. You know how everybody reads along from their own Megillahs. Right? When there's a nice trop, you hear the Elam like an undertone, humming along. The Briskerov was makpid on a Kriya of Yudalit, not to lay along with the Bal Koreh. Because he held that it has to be a Kriya being Yotze with the Bal Koreh who's being Moitzi Rabbim. Chaznish argued on that. Moshe Stemmel brings down Moedim Izmanim. He brings down from the Chaznish. The Chaznish held no. It has to be done together with a group, but it doesn't have to be a Kriya of a Rabbim. You don't have to be Yotze with a Kriya of a Rabbim. It has to be done together with a Rabbim, like we just said. It's not the regular Choivas Tzibur. It has to be done together with a Rabbim. So if you're in a room together with 10 people and it's being read loud, that's called you're going along with the Rabbim. That's enough. Even if you're laying along in an undertone, that's fine. By Krias HaTorah, it's certainly okay. Nobody's mefakbik. You're allowed to lay along with the Bal Koreh. There's also no din that you have to be Yotze. You have to hear every word. Nobody needs to be pressured by Krias HaTorah if they don't hear every word. Avada, a person's halacha is that you're supposed to listen to Krias HaTorah, but it doesn't have to be a pressure if you missed a word. And if a person misses a word, he doesn't have to say it like you do by Megillah, because there's no din that you have to say it. You have to be part of the tzibur having a Krias HaTorah, which means it's only a chayvas tzibur. Except Reb Chaim held that being part of that chayvas tzibur is a responsibility that's mutal al kol yochid v'yochid. That was Reb Chaim's Tosefes Knech. There's one other point which is part of this. What time is it? It's in the clock. What?
9:30. Allah sounds like that even when you're in a
I'm glad Reb somebody's talking up. I'm not sure if that agrees with me or not.
Allah sounds like even when you're in a tzibur, when you're part of the tzibur, then now you have to hear.
Where it talks about the terutzim in the Gemara about you lane before, do you have to listen and do you not have to listen? But that's all part of, since there's a chayva, there's a Krias HaTorah going on, so you're part of the tzibur. You can't be mezalzel, you can't walk away from the tzibur, but not that it's not your personal responsibility. Let's say you weren't there. In Volozhin they held that if you happen to be in the next room and there's Krias HaTorah going, I'm going to walk into the next room. The tzibur has Krias HaTorah, now there's no personal obligation for Krias HaTorah. It's mutal on the tzibur as a whole, not on the yochid.
The Buddha said should be medactic when you're going back to your seat. You should go in a time you shouldn't miss any words.
It's a hiddur, it's better, but not that there's a chiyuv to hear every word. Certainly not a chiyuv to hear every word. Certainly not a thing that if you miss a word you have to say along with. For sure not.
Back when we're doing pashas, they try to be able to chap the pasha.
That's a very good question. I remember being very nispo when I was a bacher. I was going to Eretz Yisrael to learn, and the last day Pesach was on Shabbos, and Rabbi Yonis and David, said they made from Chaim Berlin a minyan by Mincha. It was Achron Shal Pesach. They made a minyan where they went through the whole next pasha in order that he should. The pshat is you want to be synchronized with the olam, but again, it's a chayvus hatzibur. It's a good question. Let's say they would want to make on Shabbos of Achron Shal Pesach a separate minyan laning. Pashas doesn't work. Let's say in America, to make a Yom Tiv, to make in America a Pashas Bereshis, Simchas Torah, Zois HaBracha Bereshis minyan for Israelis is Shalai Kedin, because a Yochid who's an Israeli here keeps one day Yom Tiv. But the Tzibur certainly is not praving Zois HaBracha Bereshis. So an Israeli that's here in America for Yom Tiv, on Yom Tiv Sheni, he's certainly not, there's no Tzibur Dikadin of laning. At best, what you could say is, you're laning anyways, Shabbos by Mincha, that's a good question. Shabbos by Mincha, this is the question of, could you be Mavis Sedra from Shabbos Mincha time, next week's Parsha? Shala by the Paiskim, where does that come from? Do we say that's already the Zman of that Parsha? So if you lane the whole Parsha, is that called you synchronized with the next Parsha? That's a good Shala. But again, L'chor it's not a Chavis Yochid, Reb Chaim is Mechadish not. One other point that Reb Chaim made, there's a famous discussion which the Mishnah Berurah has, it was in Kuf Mem, I think, is the question of whether you need, when you have a minyan that's there for Krias HaTorah, I'm sure the Ayla made up with the Shaila, do you need a minyan of people that are mechuyev in Krias HaTorah? Do you need a full minyan of mechuyovim in Krias HaTorah? Let's say you put together, let's say you have let's say you don't have a minyan of people, right? You have 7 people, 8, it's getting late, you call 2 people off the street. That's not called, it's not optimal, but it's called you daven with a minyan because roiv of the tzibur is davening. You have a tzibur, and roiv of the tzibur that's there are davening, that's called you have a tzibur of ispalim. Rubai kekuloi of a tzibur that's there davening. Reb Chaim held that Moed talking that halach is only by Kaddish, Baruch Hu, Shemon Esrei, Moed D'Rabbanan, not by Krias HaTorah. There's even a famous shal that meet up with it, the Lashon what? Yeah. The Lashon Ramban, right? It's a shal of the Lashon Ramban, and there's a famous Nishmas Odom, where the Ran brings, and Reb Chaim says, Kenish Zayin that the Chai Odom forgot, and he put in a comma in the middle of, okay, it's a little bit late, we won't go into it, but Reb Chaim held that it's pashut that even where davening you can make a tzibur out of Rubai Kekuloi, but you can't do that by Krias HaTorah. Why? The rationale, the way Rabbi Chaim understood, the rationale behind that would be that by davening there is a mitzius of davening as a yokid, but the choivas tzibur barabim is a tzibur davening. Yechidim are davening. So now you have a tzibur, and you have 6 people davening. The 6 people, Rubik Kagula, that's called you have a minyan of davening. Mashenkin by Krias HaTorah, what makes the tzibur is only, there's no such thing as Krias HaTorah as Yechidim. The Krias HaTorah is only together as a rabbim. So when you have 9 people that didn't hear Krias HaTorah, you don't have a minyan of Krias HaTorah. The whole, it would be like, the analogy would be like, you have a mikveh with 38 so you want to say Rubik Kagula, the mikveh is full. That doesn't work, because you don't have a mikveh. It's only when you have a tzibus you can say Rubik Kagula on the whole thing. But you can't say Rubik Kagula when you don't have that thing in the first place. If you have a lulav that's too short, you can't say, well, Rubik Kagula, you have most of it. You have schach, if you have most, you could say the whole thing is mesuchach, but you can't say Rubik Kagula if something is open. So if you have 7 people, you don't have a tzibur that's mechuyev in Krias HaTorah. Says no Rubik Kagula. It's the same Rabbi Chaim l'shitase. Okay. But I want to point out from the Lashon of the Rambam, there's something very interesting. This is a Rambam in Hilchos Tefillah Perek Yud Beis. Moshe Rabbeinu Tikin, sheyu korin b'Torah b'Rabbim b'Shabbos b'Sheni v'Chamishi b'Shachris, kidei shelo yishu shloisha yomim b'lo shmias HaTorah. Very interesting. The Rambam uses the words, like we said before, it's the takon, they shouldn't go 3 days. We said over the Gemara, the way the Gemara says, it should be 3 days without limud HaTorah. The Rambam doesn't say that. The Rambam sticks in a word which is funny. B'lo shmias Torah. What does the Rambam mean to say with that? It's interesting. Then the Rambam brings Ezra Tzayfer Tikkun Shiur Korin Kain B'Mincha B'Chol Shabbos V'Shum Yosher Kronis. He was also Mesakin Shiur Korin B'Sheni V'Chamisha Shloshim Ne'odam V'Leikru Pochs Me'asor Psukim. Now, the din of Asor Psukim comes from Ezra Tzayfer. Moshe Rabbeinu, it's clear in the Gemara there was no such kpeda. You can lay in 3 psukim, it doesn't have to be 3 people. Then the Rambam says again, Halacha Gimel, Ein korin b'tzibur b'pochas me'asora anoshim gedolim b'nei korin ve'en korin pochas me'asora. He repeats again. The Rambam, you look, it's again, it's in Hilchos Tefillah Perek Yud Beis, the Rambam repeats again what he said in Halacha Aleph, he repeats again a second time in Halacha Gimel. The question is why? It's possible, the Rambam needs to point out like this. What would be la halacha? Let's say you laned 7 psukim. It's enough before Ezra Sefer, it was enough for Krias HaTorah. So Lama Zogan that you weren't Mekayim the Takon of Ezra Sefer. Why wouldn't you be allowed to make a bracha? Because you were Mekayim the din of Moshe Rabbeinu. Why wouldn't that be enough? So the Rambam emphasizes again, Ein korin b'Torah b'tzibur b'pochas me'asora ve'en korin pochas me'asora psukim, that there is no takonas Moshe once Ezra Sefer made his takona. Here it's interesting lashon. It's possible that what this is based on is, we still have another few minutes? It's possible the idea goes like this. And this is a little bit related to Purim, but it's an interesting yesod. What's Shmias HaTorah as opposed to Limud HaTorah? Most of our learning has to do with Torah Shebal Peh. We learn Gemara, we learn Halacha, we learn Lamdus, Be'iyun, Be'kiyus, Halacha, but most of what we learn is Torah Shebal Peh. Right? Very few of us in our primary Limud HaTorah is Torah Shebechsav. And even if you learn Chumash, you're learning with Rashi, with Mefarshim, with Midrashim. Most of it is Torah Shebal Peh. Mikra would mean taking out a Sefer Torah and laning from a Sefer Torah. Most of it, that's not our Tzuras HaLimud. The Takona of Moshe Rabbeinu was Torah Shebechsav, and something very interesting. It's a very fundamental chilik between Torah Shebechsav and Torah Shebal Peh. Torah Shebal Peh, if a person reads a Gemara and he doesn't understand what he's reading, he's not Yaitz in the mitzvah. Torah Shebechsav, even if a person doesn't understand one word of what he's reading, he's Yaitz. Why? Because the mitzvah is not so much to experience the seichel of it. The mitzvah is the words of Torah itself go into a person, they give him a kedusha. When the Rambam says that Moshe Rabbeinu wanted Klal Yisrael to go 3 days, not to go 3 days without Torah, he's not referring to Limud HaTorah. He was referring to something else. Shmiras HaTorah means the experience that Klal Yisrael gets together as a group, as a nation. Every time there's a Krias HaTorah going on, there's a mini Har Sinai. The Bal Koreh is Moshe Rabbeinu, the Gabbai, the Oila, one Gabbai on one side, the Gabbai Sheni on the other side. The Tzura standing around the Bima is a Har Sinai. Har Sinai wasn't about learning Torah, it was about becoming Torah. It was about being Mekabel Torah. The experience of Krias HaTorah, and that goes back to what we're talking about, Chovas Rabbim, is that this is not the same thing as Talmud Torah. Talmud Torah is a Chovas Yochid. Krias HaTorah is a Chovas Torahs Rabbim. The experience of Torah as a Rabbim is not the Shenantal Vonecha, learn Torah and give it over to your children, give it over to your Talmidim. That's a personal thing. The experience of Krias HaTorah is the experience of Maimon HaSinai, where Klal Yisrael stood together as a group. Moshe Rabbeinu didn't want Klal Yisrael to go 3 days without a mini Maimon HaSinai in order to keep the inspiration alive. So the Rambam is Medaik B'Lashoina, he doesn't call that Limud HaTorah or Torah. He calls that Shmiras HaTorah. That's Torah Shebechsav. Let's ask a question. We just said that L'chayre in the Rambam, it's Meduyik, that after Ezra Sefer was Masakin his takana, that you can't learn less than 10 psukim, you're not Yetzer takana of Moshe Rabbeinu. There is no din of Moshe Rabbeinu now to learn 3 psukim, you can learn 7 psukim, you can have 1 oila. There's no such thing. If you don't learn 10 psukim, don't get up and learn. Why not? Why not just learn takana as Moshe Rabbeinu? Where Ezra Sefer was mevatel takana as Moshe Rabbeinu? And the answer lies in understanding what's Moshe Rabbeinu, what's Ezra Sefer. Ezra Sefer was the beginning of Bais Sheni, and whereas in Bais Rishon the primary Torah was Torah Shebechsav, there was Nevuah, the Sifrei Nevuah, the Sifrei Nevi'im were written in Bais Rishon. Bais Sheni is the Tkufa of Torah Shebal Peh. The transfer of that Tkufa is the Nesa Purim. Kimu v'Kiblu, the Svarim say Kimu v'Kiblu is a Kabbalah Satorah on Torah Shebal Peh. Not only that, Ezra Sefer, the Gemara says Ru'uyin Hadvorin, that Ezra Sefer was on the Madrega that he should have been Mekabel Torah like Moshe Rabbeinu, except the door wasn't Roy. But the Gemara says that Ezra Sefer did have a mini giving of Torah al Yodoi. The Ksav that we use in a Sefer Torah, it's Mavur in the Gemara in Sanhedrin, the Gemara in Ma'id Cotton, the Ksav that we use in a Sefer Torah, Ksav Ashuris, the first one who established that to be written in a Sefer Torah was Ezra Sefer. Until the days of Ezra Sefer, they used what they call Ksav Ivri, which was some type of, you can see a picture of it, it's like hieroglyphics, it's like script. But the writing of Ksav Ashuris was Messiah of Torah Shebal Peh. To be written in the Sefer Torah itself, Ksav Ashuris, was only Mimois Ezra Ve'elech. Which means that what Ezra Sefer did was, he was given Min HaShamayim the role of creating that the primary Krias HaTorah is now a different Krias HaTorah. It's not Torah Shebechsav anymore. It's Torah Shebal Peh. Torah Shebechsav is about Klal Yisrael getting together, Kabbalah HaTorah, where you learn from the Sefer Torah. That's not our Limud HaTorah. Our Limud HaTorah is as Yechidim. But there's a mini Maimon HaSinai that goes on every time by Krias HaTorah. That's called Kabbalah Krias HaTorah. Ezra Sefer gave that a spin, a certain definition of Torah Shebal Peh, a raya. The Rambam, a few halachas later, brings out, not halachas it's negeh. If you want, you could see it. You go to a Teimonish Shul, you can hear what it looks like when they learn the Targum while they're learning Chumash. Ezra Sefer, you ever saw it? A Teimonim? Fascinating. Go to Teimonish Shul till today. They say it a little bit differently than our Targum, but the Ma'aseh they do it. There's a Targum. We don't follow it because we don't understand the Targum. If anything, we understand the Chumash, not the Targum. But they have a Targum that comes from Ezra Sefer to lane with the Targum. What does that mean? That means that Ezra Sefer was Misakin, that from the beginning of Bais Sheni and on, the Krias HaTorah, that they laned was an experience of Torah Shebal Peh. The difference between 3 psukim that was laned by Moshe Rabbeinu and 10 psukim that was laid by Ezra Sefer is a different experience. 3 psukim is a function of, there's a kriya. It could be one person being oil, it doesn't make a difference. As long as there's a kriya, and as long as everybody got together, like the Rambam says, Lishmias HaTorah. 10 psukim is already a shiur of limud HaTorah. There are rayas. We don't have time now to why 3 is Shmias HaTorah, Krias HaTorah, and 10 is limud HaTorah. But Ezra HaSofer established in Krias HaTorah another level of Krias HaTorah, which is called Torah Sheba'al Peh. It's called limud HaTorah. So that's why the Rambam is medayik to say the Lashonos differently. Okay, there's more to say on the topic. I'll finish off with one thing. And that is, one of the Yonim in Kollel Yisrael today is the kinyan that we have in Eretz Yisrael. Limud HaTorah in Eretz Yisrael. Especially when Limud HaTorah as the sole schus of Kim Eretz Yisrael is under attack. It's a point that we have to make. Moshe Rabbeinu gave over the role of capturing Eretz Yisrael to his Talmud Muvik Yeshua ben Nun. Yeshua ben Nun captures Eretz Yisrael. It says in the Gemara that when Kollel Yisrael was kicked out of Eretz Yisrael by Nebuchadnezzar, that Kiddush of Eretz Yisrael became bottle. Kitcher Scheiner became bottle. Once Ezra HaSofer recaptured Eretz Yisrael, he didn't recapture, Kollel Yisrael went back to Eretz Yisrael. Kitcher Shnia, Kitcher Laslav. We spoke about it one time, over here. Bez Hashem, right? That was the last year that was over here. That halacha, the Chassam Sofer says something fascinating. He says, is based on that Moshe Rabbeinu's kibush, the only thing that conquers Eretz Yisrael, the only thing that gives us chus for Yidden to live in Eretz Yisrael, the terminology we use. A person has Daled Amis in Eretz Yisrael, what do we call it in our world? Daled Amis Shel Halacha. It's one and the same. Daled Amis Shel Halacha, Daled Amis Eretz Yisrael is one Metzias. There is no Metzias of Eretz Yisrael without Torah. But there's a different Torah. Not a different Torah, but a different focus. Bais Rishon, which was a result of Moshe Rabbeinu, Yeshua ben Nun, was related to Torah Shebechsav. That was the Takon of Moshe Rabbeinu. Our primarily limud HaTorah is Torah Sheba'al Peh. So whereas Torah Shebechsav, B'midah Mesuyem is seized to become the Ikar focus of Kollel Yisrael, we don't have Nevuah B'zman Hazeh. We don't have Nevi'im. The scriptures are closed. We can't add more. There's no Nevuah, there's no Ruach HaKodesh B'zman Hazeh. But every time a Yid sits and learns, and he has his way of understanding a Taisus, his way of learning a Mogen Avram, a Bir Halacha, a Mishnah Brura, he's adding to Torah Sheba'al Peh. So Torah Sheba'al Peh never changed. Torah Sheba'al Peh is something Kollel Yisrael never lost. So the schus of Eretz Yisrael, which is Torah Sheba'al Peh based, was never lost. The schus that Kollel Yisrael has in Eretz Yisrael, which is Torah Shebechsav based, that comes from Moshe and Yeshua, when Kollel Yisrael was sent away from Eretz Yisrael, they lost that koyach, they lost that connection. So that Kedusha Eretz Yisrael was lost. But the Kedusha Shnia is related to all of us that are sitting in the Bais Medrash. Every Bais Medrash is Shtik Eretz Yisrael. Every place where Yidden sit B'dal Am Shel Halacha, they're sitting B'dal Am Shel Eretz Yisrael. So Eretz Yisrael is alive and well. We didn't lose our Kedusha Eretz Yisrael. So that's why that Kedusha Eretz Yisrael is a continuum. Never gets lost. It's Hashem, should be Zeichim, Yetz Hashem, that this year's Korban Pesach, Yetz Hashem, should be in Yerushalayim Yer HaKodesh, together with all of Kollel Yisrael. Zeichim, the Elam should, Yetz Hashem, should continue to steig, to grow. A guten saves man. Yetz Hashem, everybody should have a kosher and Yom Tif.